Well, good morning and welcome to our virtual Sunday school lesson for October 27th. And I'll go ahead and give you a little heads up. I could not upload my lesson last Saturday. I filmed it and I could not upload it because I was having issues with my phone. And I don't know if I've got that resolved. So if this goes, cuts off or something, please just indulge me in trying to get that fixed. But we're talking about family. This is our third Sunday to talk about family. And today we're in Genesis chapter 25 and 27. And we're talking about Jacob and Esau, Rebekah and Isaac. We're talking about this family of four. And there's so many things in here that are so fascinating to me. But I just want to read a little bit of it. And I want to read more than your literature calls for, because there's just some things I feel like we have to cover. So I'm going to be in Genesis chapter 25, and I'm going to start in verse 21. And it says that Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Well, right there you have some interesting things. Because in ancient times, the oldest was always the heir apparent. The oldest would receive the bulk of the inheritance. The oldest would inherit the patriarchal responsibilities. And so God here is telling Rebekah that he's going to do things different. With her family, he's going to do things different. He's going to take the second born, and they're twins, so some people would say, well, what's the difference? Well, it still mattered. Who was born first was considered the firstborn. And so God here is explaining to her that he's going to upend the natural order of things. That's kind of interesting, because we've been studying a lot on Sunday nights the last few weeks about some of the things that Jesus has taught about putting other people first. And if you want to be first, you have to put yourself last. That when you are trying to elevate yourself and you want to be first, that you actually are putting yourself at the bottom. You know, in other words, God is saying that his economy doesn't work like human earthly economy. That he who wants to be first should put himself last. You should be humble. And that's just completely opposite of the world. The world is you put yourself first, you take care of you. And if you're the firstborn, you take everything that you've got coming to you. And God is telling Rebekah, that's not how I'm going to do these things. I've chosen Jacob to be the heir apparent to the seed of Abraham. Remember, this all started with Isaac's father, Abraham. When God called Abraham and created in him a seed that he was going to produce a nation of people that would be a holy people, a people who would bring Messiah into the world, a people who would give us the Old Testament, people who would give us temple worship, who would explain to us the priesthood and demonstrate and observe the priesthood and the sacrificial system and everything that the world needed to know in order to be in a right relationship with God. The seed of Abraham was chosen by God to be those people. And God has decided that with Isaac, he's not going to take the firstborn, Esau, but the secondborn, Jacob. And that's just unusual, but God has decided that's how he's going to do it. Now, I have to go to Romans chapter 9. This is something that we studied recently on Wednesday night. We've talked about the doctrine of election. And some people take the doctrine of election and go to this far extreme situation whereby they believe that God has chosen some people for salvation and he chose everybody else for hell. Now, a lot of people who believe that don't say it that way, but the logical conclusion is if God created everybody and he only wanted some to be saved, then he apparently wanted everybody else for hell. And one of the scriptures that they use comes from Romans chapter 9. And in Romans chapter 9, Paul says this, "One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who resists his will? But who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, why did you make me like this? In other words, how can I dare say to God, why did you create me this way? He says, does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for noble purposes and some for common use? Interestingly enough, Paul is talking here a lot to the Roman church. He's talking a lot about Israel and the fact that Israel was created for a noble purpose, but not every Israelite chose to live up to that inheritance. We've talked on Sunday mornings about how the chosen family of Israel, everybody who was born a descendant of Abraham, including Jacob and Esau, was part of this covenant. But not everyone chose to live up to the covenant. So here, Paul is saying that God can make out of the same lump of clay someone who has a noble purpose and someone who has a more common purpose. So my Calvinist friends of the extreme variety would say that those who are made for common use are those who are made for hell. Well, that's not the logical understanding. If you made something for common use, it simply means it's like an everyday use. And I've used this many times before. My wife has everyday dishes. My wife has fine china. And they have different purposes. But we don't have everyday dishes that we can smash on the ground and destroy. So to say that God would make someone for a common use and then turn around and say that that common use is to burn in hell is not really logical. Okay, so let's go back to Genesis here. When Paul said, out of the same lump of clay, Jacob and Esau are twins. They are created from the DNA of Isaac and Rebekah. They are literally from the same lump of clay. And yet, God has decided that Jacob is going to be used for a more noble purpose, which is to continue the line that is eventually going to lead us to Messiah. That does not mean that he doesn't like Esau. It does not mean that Esau was created for hell. In fact, the Bible speaks very clearly that Esau was blessed by God. Esau was ordained by God. Esau was created by God. But the reality is they can't both be the genealogical line that leads to Messiah. And God has decided it's going to be Jacob. And so what Paul is saying in Romans 9 is, who are we to argue over whether it should be Jacob or Esau? That's God's decision, and it doesn't matter to us. But I want you to understand, Esau was still held accountable. There's a very interesting passage in Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, if you want to go look it up. It says, see that no one is sexually immoral, comma, or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. What is he talking about? Look at verse 24 of Genesis chapter 25. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Okay, so here's one of the first problems that I see in here is that the family they've chosen favorites. Now, Rebekah may have chosen Jacob as her favorite because God had told her that Jacob, the younger, was going to be the one who was going to have God's blessing. A greater blessing, let me put it that way. So maybe that's why she chose that. I'm curious, and the scripture doesn't tell us, did she tell Isaac about her prayer and what God had told her? Did she explain this to him? I don't know. But the reality is they are playing favorites, and that's just a human thing that we do, and it's not right, but that's how we are. So in verse 29, it says, once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished. That is why he was also called Edom. And Jacob replied, first sell me your birthright. Look, I'm about to die, Esau said. What good is the birthright to me? But Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Okay, so up to this point, the only person that we are certain of who knew that God's plan was to choose Jacob to carry the line of Messiah was his mother Rebekah. We don't know that she has told her husband, certainly don't know that she has told her children, that she may have. We don't know that. So all we know is she's the only one for certain who knows this. So apparently the two brothers are still under the understanding or the assumption that the older Esau is carrying the birthright. He is the heir apparent. And what you have here is that Esau, according to Hebrews, sold his inheritance for a single meal. So what the writer of Hebrews is saying, this is God speaking now, this is the inspiration of the Holy Spirit through the writer of Hebrews saying that Esau was so common. The word here in the English is godless, but if you go back to the Greek in the book of Hebrews, it's just a word that means common. It means profane. Profane, we think of profane as like dirty words, but profane simply means common, something that is not intended for a noble purpose. Words that are not edifying or sacred are common words. And so profanity just means common. And so this word that is rendered godless just means common. But the interesting thing is that Paul said in Romans chapter 9 that God can create people for common use and people for more noble use, and that is his choice, his will. But then you have the human capacity to decide, do I want to be common or do I want to be more noble? You say, well, wait a minute, how can the two both be there? I don't really understand. I know that, as I've said many times before, God has an overarching plan of redemption. And that plan is going to happen. It's a done deal. God will not let anything or anybody stop it. But within that plan, God has his will. God has allowed human history and creation and us, all of humanity and the world that he created, everything is part of and exists under that arching plan of redemption. And so my job is to find out, where do I fit into that plan? Because God has invited all of humanity to be conformed to the image of Christ, to plug into that plan. Most people simply choose not to. They prefer to be common and to not be noble. You say, that doesn't make any sense if God can choose you for one or two. But look, consider Esau. God has chosen that Esau's not going to be the one who carries the line of Messiah, but he's still held accountable according to the book of Hebrews, because otherwise the writer of Hebrews could not say, don't let anybody see that nobody is godless or common like Esau. So the reality is that you have within you the human capacity to decide, do I want to be common? Do I want to be noble? And what I find in Paul is he's saying that out of the same lump of clay, literally out of the same DNA, out of the same family, out of two twins, you can have one who has chosen to be common and one who has chosen to be noble. But then at the same time, the Bible indicates that God had picked one for common purpose and one for noble. And you have to wonder, did God know how Esau was going to respond? Did God know what Esau was going to do? Certainly he did. God knew everything. God has foreknowledge. God knows everything. And I've said this before, and I understand it's hard to wrap your brain around. God is above time. God is not watching history unfold. God knows the whole history. When you look at this Bible and it tells you everything from Genesis to Revelation, everything from beginning to end, and Jesus himself said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. What he's saying, God is above time. And so this plan of redemption, it exists outside of time. Time is just part of God's creation. He created time for us. So we could watch and we could know, where are we on the schedule? Okay? So as we think of time as unfolding and we experience time and we experience history as it happens, God's looking over the whole thing, and as far as he's concerned, it's already happened. Because if God already knows what's going to happen, it's as good as if it's predetermined. People sometimes misunderstand the concept of predetermined. We think that God decided who will be saved and who will not be saved, that God decided how people will react. Well, if God has predetermined everything, logic, okay, apply logic. If God predetermined everything, then you have to say, if I sin, God predetermined that I would sin. Well, no, God is not the author of sin. But predetermination simply means that if God already knows what I'm going to do tomorrow, and if God knows everything and he knows what's going to happen, it's as if it's already happened. And from his point of view, because he lives above time, it already has. When the Bible says that Jesus was the lamb slain from the creation of the world, that means that when the world was created and the whole plan of redemption was started, Jesus Christ, even though from our perspective was not going to die for 4,000 years after Adam, right? But from God's perspective, looking at it now, it's as if it's already happened. It's hard to wrap your brain around that. But we have to realize God knows everything, God sees everything, and he's looking at the whole of human history as if it has already been completed. When Jesus says, I am the beginning and the end, he doesn't mean when we get to the end, I'm going to take over. He is the all-encompassing Christ. He's already seen the end. He's already, it's as if it's already happened. We simply have not experienced it yet. I know that's a lot. But I want you to understand that it can be true that God could choose Jacob for a more noble purpose and Esau for a more common purpose. But at the same time, God will hold them accountable for what do they want. Do I want to be common? Do I want to be godless? Do I want to be the kind of person who takes my position in the family so lightly that I would sell it for a meal? That was a very reckless and impetuous thing for him to do, and that gives you a little insight into who he is. So then when you get to chapter 27, and if you know the story, there's a little trick played, because Isaac, it says in chapter 27, Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak. It's raining out here. You can hear that. Let's hope it doesn't interfere too much. His eyes were so weak that he could no longer see. He called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, My son, here I am, he answered. Isaac said, I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your weapons, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." So here's an interesting thing. So Isaac is old, and he wants to give Esau his blessing as the firstborn, as the birthright, the heir apparent, even though God had already told Rebekah years ago, it's not for Esau, it's going to be Jacob. I just have to ask the question, did these two not talk about this? Did she not ever say to him, God spoke to me after he gave me these children? God spoke to me and said, it's going to be Jacob. Did she tell him and Isaac didn't believe her? Or is it that Isaac is just so enamored of Esau that he's not going to do God's will?